Really special to be speaking at this venue. As Sarah mentioned, two of my nonfiction books were CLSC selections, and I've had the privilege of speaking here a number of times, including here in the Hall of Philosophy, one of my favorite venues. After my wife Laura and I discovered Chautauqua during these early book gigs, we brought our own kids here when they were little. We came to love the creative, artistic spirit that makes this place so special, so I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be talking about this novel, because the qualities and the values that I try to capture in this book in many ways mirror all of the great qualities that define Chautauqua and the wonderful people here. So let me start by telling you a little bit about how I came to write this book, The Heiress of Pittsburgh, what the story's about, and then we'll have questions from our fabulous moderator, Sarah, and from all of you in the audience. So, how I came to write this, as Sarah mentioned, I've written several nonfiction books that were fortunately successful. My Archibald Cox book, dealing with Watergate, came out in the middle of the impeachment trial of Bill Clinton in 1998-99. So I had the honor of being an amphitheater speaker that year to talk about that fast-moving national drama. Who would have thought presidential scandals that we'd be talking about that? It was quite a thrill for a young author, although I have to tell you it was pretty daunting at that time as someone who had just started down this path. But I can tell you, if any of you are thinking of becoming authors, writing a novel like this is 100 times scarier. Unlike nonfiction, there's no exact beginning or end to the story. There's no birth date of the principal character in the story. There's no career trajectory to chronicle. With fiction, you have to invent the whole thing. Every day you have to get up, sit up at your desk, dig into your imagination to create imaginary characters and made-up locations that look and feel like real places. And then it all has to be woven together to tell a compelling story. And it can't just be a story that you care about. It has to be a story that appeals to unknown readers who will one day pass judgment very swiftly on this thing with brutal assessments like, too wordy, not enough description in this thing, I don't like these characters are too nice, or the most damning assessment of all, it's fine. It's fine after all of this, and then they go back to watching The Office on Netflix because they find that more interesting. It's devastating. So when you're writing fiction, you never know for sure if it's going to turn into a smash hit or if it is just going to end up in the recycled book bin somewhere. You have to do it because you love it. You have to want to get up every day because it's who you are, and you have to care about this story that's taking shape in your mind so much that you're prepared to write it and finish it even if you never see the book in print. As long as you tell the story you feel you needed to tell, you've accomplished your job. And hopefully, in the process, at least a few people will read it so that it touches others and advances the human condition, which is, of course, the ultimate goal here. So let me tell you about my own journey in writing The Heiress of Pittsburgh. And incidentally, it had plenty of other titles before I settled on that one. This story was bubbling up inside of me for decades. I started working on it, as Sarah said, over 30 years ago when I was a young lawyer in downtown Pittsburgh. And even before I started writing those nonfiction books, I began toying with the idea of writing a novel. And I knew I wanted it to be about Pittsburgh and places like Pittsburgh. The main character in this book is a guy named Sean Rossi. And like him, I had grown up in the working class town of Swissvale on the east end of Pittsburgh, took a bus and attended Pitt like most of my friends, and then miraculously found myself admitted to Harvard Law School because they made a mistake and let in a couple of Pittsburghers every once in a while. So there were superficial similarities that created a shell around which to build the novel, because you need a framework to start with. But the story that takes shape in The Heiress of Pittsburgh was and is purely fiction, and that's where all the hard work came in. I was obsessed with trying to capture Pittsburgh as a character in the book, having grown up in this gritty little mill town in the Monongahela, or any of you who are from there know the Mon River Valley. Before I left for law school, I'd come to realize how special these little towns in Pittsburgh and places like it were. They were filled with bigger-than-life characters. Everyone had a nickname. They were mostly immigrants or children of immigrants or grandchildren of immigrants of every color and ethnic stripe imaginable. They were funny, irreverent, simple in their needs. They were fabulous storytellers, raconteurs. At the same time, they were devoted, loyal, inventive, smart, and talented, especially in making things with their hands from scratch. Even though many or most of these people didn't have much formal education. And they were ready to step up and do anything if someone needed help. And I'm sure many of your own family members came from that background, had many of these same qualities. The place itself, stop and think about it too, was packed with vivid imagery, and I couldn't shake those images out of my mind. So when I went away to law school up at Harvard, I remember going to bed at night and closing my eyes and be able to, I couldn't just get them out of my head, the pictures of the red and orange flames roaring out of the steel mills at night along the river, and the smokestacks belching smoke, and little houses sided with insul brick because it was cheaper than real bricks, and churches with crooked crosses signifying the Eastern European Rite, and hard-working communities where people looked after each other and celebrated births, baptisms, weddings, and even mourned together at funeral homes. And my wife Laura and I actually saw this where the viewing rooms at times were adorned, the viewing rooms for caskets at times were adorned with pictures of Kennywood Amusement Park, or the Dorothy Six blast furnaces, or scenes that reflected the arc of what was most meaningful in these people's lives during the time they were on Earth. I wanted to write a story that amounted to a great poem about Pittsburgh and these places, a love story to Pittsburgh, because today, in most places, it seems these qualities are vanishing and these virtues are dying off. And the truth is, I always say you couldn't buy them today for $1 million. But how do you reduce these things to words on paper? That isn't easy at all. You have to figure out how to capture the people, the imagery, this sooty, rough, but it's beautiful, rough but beautiful imagery. Almost, I would imagine in my head, like an artist struggles to get something down on canvas, layer after layer. I felt a lot of pressure not to screw this project up, because I felt an obligation to do justice to these remarkable working class towns that really, in my view, summed up and still sum up the very best qualities of America, but are slowly vanishing. So this novel opens up with a scene in the North Braddock Catholic Cemetery. And here a grave is being dug up for a DNA test in a court case. A group of onlookers, including lawyers and a trial judge, are watching with trepidation. And here I try to paint a picture from this vantage point on the hillside. So here's the opening. High above the bend in the Monongahela River, which flowed south to north toward the city, I could see ancient grave markers, Roman Catholic crucifixes, Byzantine crosses, and other tributes to the dead that were stained with mill soot but otherwise nicely preserved. Instead of pointing skyward toward heaven, these memorials sloped downward to provide a sweeping view of the Edgar Thompson steel plant, the last operating mill in the valley where Andrew Carnegie had created his steel empire in the 1880s, and the silenced blast furnaces of the Cary furnace, which had once supplied molten pig iron to the adjacent mills. In these communities, most local families had found work, constructed homes, and built livelihoods during industrial migrations of a past era. So next, the workers pull up this casket, and the exhumation takes a surprise turn. And this is where the story kind of gets up on its feet and starts walking around on its own, developing a plot as the characters discover that the wrong body is in the coffin. So here's a little excerpt. As the lid rose, rain doused the coffin's moldy silk liner. One worker covered his mouth, suppressing an urge to gag. Judge Wendell hurriedly lit a Kent cigarette and sucked down a bolus of menthol smoke. A light-skinned black man with graying hair, the judge was known for maintaining his cool under fire. Now his eyes opened to the size of quarters. He seemed interested in viewing the decedent, whose alleged act of sexual gratification a half-century earlier had spawned this messy will contest and consumed a week of his orphan's court calendar. "That's one ugly biddy," exclaimed the worker with the bandana, peering inside. We all stared at the corpse. Even 30 years after death, she would have benefited from a radical nose job. "Who the hell is this?" My co-counsel pointed at the imposter. The woman in the coffin wore a purple chiffon dress discolored by green mold and a white wig that had jarred loose. Her wrinkled face with its hooked Eastern European nose had become eerily wax-colored from embalming fluid in the passage of time. "That's the grave wax," the deputy coroner whispered to the judge. "This sure as hell ain't Ralph Atnovic, the guy we're looking for." So I wanted to use Pittsburgh as a character in this book and build the framework around this battle over inheriting a multi-million-dollar trust fund in Orphans Court. Most people, including most lawyers, don't know much about that court. We have a few lawyers here. Any of you ever practiced at all in Orphans Court? It is archaic, mysterious. It's a place where disputes over wills and estates and trusts are fought out, often with dramatic outcomes. So as a young lawyer, I handled hundreds of cases in Orphans Court, and this obscure place, hidden away at the top of the Frick building, to me seemed like a living, breathing soap opera. It was the ugliest secrets about families and ex-families came spilling out in these Orphans Court proceedings, and the judges tended to handle things in their own ways to bring order to the chaos. And so here is how Judge Warren Wendell, a character in the story, deals with one outburst. The judge grabbed his gavel and banged it repeatedly to restore order. "Let's try to maintain some professional decorum here," Judge Wendell said, holding up a hand as if to stop a runaway truck. "We're in Orphans Court. Do you all understand the significance of that? We don't tolerate loud disruptions or shouting around here. Do you all catch my drift?" The judge leaned over the bench, stared directly at our opposing counsel, and whispered, "Because all of our clients are dead." So in one case I handled in Orphans Court, I remember learning something that jolted me. I discovered how brutally unwed mothers and their so-called illegitimate children were treated by their communities and also by the legal system until very recently in modern times, as recently as the 1970s. Under the law as it existed for over 100 years, these mothers and babies couldn't even inherit like normal people because they were considered, quote, children of no one. And they were stamped with this badge of shame. And I did research and found out a place called the Rosalia Foundling Home. It was a home for unwed mothers in the Hill District, not far from where my office is at Duquesne University, where pregnant girls in Pittsburgh were often sent to have their babies in secret, and where they then usually put them up for adoption so their sins wouldn't be discovered by their neighbors and family members. And incidentally, I don't know if any of you are from the Pittsburgh area and saw in the paper, but we recently learned that our new mayor, Pittsburgh's new mayor, Ed Gainey, was born in the Roselia home, something that was just disclosed, as was Tom Vilsack, former Iowa governor, who's now U.S. Secretary of Agriculture. Few people had ever heard of it, except for a small circle who kept it under wraps. So I had to do some discreet digging, and I even located some of the amazing Sisters of Charity who had worked in the Roselia home during the 50s and 60s before it moved from the Hill District and ultimately shut down. And they shared stories of how they had protected these girls and their babies when the system seemed totally stacked against them. So this tension involving unwed mothers and their so-called bastard children became the center of conflict in the courtroom piece of the drama. So this main character, Sean Rossi, has come back to Pittsburgh after going off to Harvard. He'd set up his own little estates firm trying to do good for regular people where he grew up. And now he's dragged into representing his ex-college girlfriend, Marjorie, who dumped him just as he graduated from law school, taking off to California. Marjorie's mother, Lil, we learn, got pregnant out of wedlock as a teenager. She claims the father was this low-life boy named Ralph Akmovic, who took her to Kennywood Park to the picnic there and took advantage of her in the parking lot. Lil was sent off by her parents to the Roselia home, and that's where Marjorie was born, kept secret by the nuns who guarded these girls fiercely. Marjorie, like most of these children, was supposed to be put up for adoption, but a kind Polish nun with a big white bonnet and big ears convinced the family to keep the baby and raised the baby as if she was the child of the grandmother, who they then called Aunt Peg, to obscure the true identity of the mother. And this is, as you may know, how things actually happened by then. It is just really amazing when you dig into some of these stories. So as the courtroom drama, trial in front of Judge Wendell escalates, Marjorie and her family have to prove she's the legitimate, illegitimate daughter of Ralph Akmovic and convince the judge that these harsh laws dealing with illegitimate children that were in effect at the time the trust was created shouldn't apply. That's the only way they can inherit several millions of dollars they believe they're entitled to from this hidden trust fund. Otherwise, the family is going to lose everything. Now, Sean is still bitter and resentful about how Marjorie dumped him. He's also freaked out that she has reappeared in his life now. His wife, Christine, recently died of ovarian cancer. He's struggling to come to grips with this loss. He's trying to raise 2 teenage daughters who are having difficulty coping. He's only handling this case because he feels he can't abandon Marjorie's family. Marjorie's grandparents, Aunt Peg and Choppy is his nickname, are elderly now, and they're about to lose their home and everything they've ever worked for from taking out too many second mortgages to keep their family afloat. This is 2008, and the economy is crashing. They're barely hanging on by a thread. Through flashbacks to the 1970s, during college and law school, when Sean is dreaming of a future with Marjorie, we see why he became so attached to her family and wants to save them now. Choppy, incidentally, is, as he describes himself, he's a colorful mill hunky. And this was a term of endearment, any of you who grew up in any of these mill towns, in these ethnic communities, at least among people who shared this common background. Choppy has worked his whole life at the Carey Furnace in Rankin, which is a dirty, dangerous mill where people of every race and ethnicity placed loyalty and faithfulness to family and friends above all else. They had to watch each other's backs. It was the true American melting pot, and it was that simple working class integrity that Sean admires so much about Choppy. And Aunt Peg, who again is really Marjorie's grandmother, has now been incapacitated by a stroke, and so she is forced to watch this trial silently from a wheelchair. In her day, though, Aunt Peg was an incredible lady. She even shared with Sean in clandestine chats over coffee and Slovak bread private stories of how she and other ladies in the neighborhood survived during World War II when their husbands were shipped off to the war and women had to work around the clock out of necessity. How did they do it and raise their families at the same time? Aunt Peg tries to pass along these secrets to Sean, worrying that he and Marjorie are struggling with their separation and how to juggle two careers eventually and hold their lives together. So here is one scene. Aunt Peg removed a loaf of Town Talk bread from the fridge and knocked it against her countertop to see if it had thawed enough for tuna sandwiches. Maybe it looked like we were poor bohunks, as some of those fancier people called us, but we had a magical network in place, Sean boy, she said. Everyone was trained to help each other in the mills, so they did the same at home. It's amazing to think about it now. We helped each other with the cooking, even with the kids' schoolwork. We had close friends and family chipping in without ever asking. I look back and ask myself, how did we pull it off? Today you'd have to be a damn millionaire to do all that. That's what Choppy always says, and he's right. Aunt Peg walked over, staring out the window at the row of Insel brick houses beside her own, then kissed me on the forehead. I'm sharing this secret with you, Sean boy, because you're a very special person in our family. Aunt Peg pauses, then concludes, sometimes, Sean boy, you have to settle for less now to get more in the long haul. Do you understand what I'm saying? I may be an old Slovak lady, but I'm 100% sure on this one. Of course, Sean and Marjorie don't end up together in the end. Things quickly unravel, and I won't ruin the story by telling you how that happened. But now Sean is in a no-win position. He cares about her parents and grandparents, Choppy and Peg, doesn't want their lives destroyed, but in the midst of trial, when Marjorie says that she is coming back to testify, Sean becomes unglued. Why does she keep coming back into his life when she's already destroyed his life's plans and his self-esteem once? And what is she hiding here? There seem to be a lot of secrets about Marjorie's past that Sean wants to know about. But this is just as much about Sean's struggles as it is about Marjorie's. He once had these Pollyannish dreams of coming back to this shabby mill town where he grew up to do good for regular people, but now he's losing faith in all of that. And this is something, incidentally, that I think many of us face in our lives. We suddenly look around and say, did I make the right decision, or did I throw away better opportunities, more lucrative opportunities, just to do something impulsive because at the time it seemed pretty noble? And I think especially if you're a person who took the less ordinary path in life at any stage, these doubts can haunt you. And that's exactly what's eating away at Sean right now. Coming out of Harvard Law School, Sean could have gone to big firms in New York or LA or Miami, any of the most choice destinations of that time period. He could have worked somewhere where he pulled down big bucks, become a big shot partner, or he could have uprooted himself to follow Marjorie to a new place called Silicon Valley, where she was looking to break into a new field called computer science at this time. Instead, he followed his heart out of a sense of duty and returned to Pittsburgh to this modest two-person law firm to handle wills and estates, thinking that that was his noble calling. But now the mills and the economic drivers of this region have become collapsing around him, and Sean's two-person law firm, this kind of shabby little place, is barely holding its own. It's hardly a ticket to wealth or notoriety, so he's doubting all of his big life decisions. And even worse, he's representing the one person he vowed never to go near again, literally or figuratively. Marjorie's reappearance is making his mind become scrambled and crazy, so he finally hits a wall. He's standing in the courtroom during a break turns to his millennial law associate named Jamie Vaskov, JV as she's known. She's 8 months pregnant, his closest confidant, and he says, "You're taking over this case." He snaps it to her and shoves the file in her arms. "Are you freaking out here, boss?" JV demands, concerned by the crazy look in his eyes. "No, I'm not freaking out," he replies coolly. "This is just too much for me to handle, so I'm bailing. You're a moot court champ." JV attended Duquesne Law Night School, incidentally, obviously. "You know the case. You can deal with the next witness, counselor." So with no time to prepare, this young associate JV is forced to gather everything together hurriedly at the counsel table, then stand in front of the judge and go for a Hail Mary pass. She knows that the old law still applies to this trust that says unwed mothers and their illegitimate children can't inherit from an estate unless it's a rare case. They're considered filius nullius, children of no one. So she makes a desperate appeal to justice and equity as a last resort. So here's this young law associate making her plea. "The authority is there, Your Honor," JV said, pulling out a brief she had completed the night before and handing it to the judge's clerk. "If you read this memorandum, Your Honor, you'll see that early cases going back to the creation of Orphans Court give you a certain amount of inherent power when it comes to evaluating the equities of a case." Judge Wendell flipped through the brief. He puffed out his cheeks as if thinking intently. "We recognize that the intentions of the deceased ordinarily govern," JV continued, "but what about the living? What if they were ruined by the acts of a decedent who's no longer around to pay the price? That's exactly what these equity cases talk about." Thick lines appeared on Judge Wendell's forehead as JV continued. "What about the girl? What about the family who never got a dime from this man who preyed on young, vulnerable girls?" JV pushed the red hair out of her face. She was sweating now. I started to worry that this emotional plea was taking a physical toll on her, standing there with her hand on her stomach. "Think about your own experiences, Judge," JV concluded nearly inaudibly, almost laboring in her breathing. "Unless you cut off this sort of discriminatory conduct root and branch, the cancer of these injustices will keep eating away at our justice system forever. This is Orphans Court, Judge. You can do something different here. Fairness and equity matter in this place more than anywhere else in our court system. Thank heavens that's true." Judge Wendell looked around the courtroom. He seemed to be examining the place that had been his judicial domain for 21 years. He stared at Aunt Peg in her wheelchair, her chin slumped against her shoulder, a slow, thin drool escaping from her lips. His eyes next moved toward Choppy, whose tongue was trying desperately to conceal a chew that he'd snuck into his lower lip to calm his nerves. Unfortunately, even the judge knows he's in a bind here. The evidence isn't there. The now ancient nuns who worked at the Rosalia home can't testify about Marjorie being the true daughter of the perpetrator, Ralph Atmavic. It would breach their pledge of secrecy to thousands of girls and babies at the Rosalia home, whose privacy they still have to safeguard. The whole situation is unraveling. The mortgage company is foreclosing on Choppy and Peg's house. The sheriff's office has just served papers. And without giving anything away, I can tell you that Sean and his co-counsel decide to push the envelope too far in one final desperate effort to achieve what they think is justice. And now they may face disbarment and have their careers ruined. How can it get any worse? Which brings us to a more practical question. Why in God's name would anyone spend 30 years writing a novel like this? So rather than trying to answer that question, I think I'll stop here, let our fabulous moderator, Sarah, ask some questions, and then invite you to ask questions too. I really do want to thank you for being part of this special event, because to me, this place represents the very best qualities that we should continue to preserve for future generations so that they can carry on these traditions of creative dialogue and civil discourse in this wonderful hall of philosophy. So thank you very much.